If you examine the Soviet state budget records from 1989, you will see something extraordinary. You will see revenue projections that assumed oil would trade at $28 per barrel. You will see military expenditure commitments totaling 80 billion rubles. You will see a deficit that consumed 12% of GDP. You will see the financial death certificate of a superpower written in red ink. In 1980, the Soviet Union was not just a nuclear power. It was an economy that generated over $800 billion in annual output. It was a system that employed 126 million workers across 15 republics. It was a treasury that collected taxes from Minsk to Vladivostok and spent them on an empire that spanned 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The Soviet planners believed their command economy was immune to capitalist boom-bust cycles. They believed central planning could outperform market chaos. They believed they had discovered a scientific approach to economic management that would prove Marx correct and Adam Smith obsolete. But they forgot one fundamental truth. They forgot that you cannot spend what you do not earn. They did not realize that empires built on deficit spending collapse when the creditors stop lending and the treasury runs dry. This is the story of how economic warfare destroyed the Soviet Union before a single shot was fired in anger. The Americans did it not by defeating Soviet armies, but by breaking Soviet budgets. This is not a story of military conquest. It is a story of financial strangulation executed through oil markets, arms race escalation, and systematic revenue destruction. It is the ultimate proof that in modern conflict, the treasury breaks first, the army breaks second, the empire breaks last. To understand how the Soviet economy collapsed, we must go back to its creation. Vladimir Lenin seized power in October 1917, promising bread, peace, and land. What he delivered was a command economy designed for permanent mobilization. The Bolsheviks nationalized industry, collectivized agriculture, and subordinated all economic activity to state control. The system was optimized for one thing: concentrating resources for military production. Joseph Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union through terror and forced extraction. Between 1928 and 1940, he transformed an agricultural backwater into an industrial power. Soviet steel production increased from 4 million tons to 18 million tons. Coal output rose from 35 million tons to 166 million tons. Tank factories, aircraft plants, and munitions works sprouted across the Urals. The human cost was catastrophic. Millions died in famines, purges, and labor camps, but Stalin achieved his goal. He built a war machine. This system worked brilliantly for its intended purpose. During World War II, Soviet factories produced more tanks than Germany despite losing Ukraine and Western Russia. The command economy could mobilize labor, commandeer resources, and prioritize military production with ruthless efficiency. When the goal was survival, when the timeline was immediate, the Soviet system excelled. But peacetime exposed fatal flaws. The command economy could not innovate. It could not respond to consumer demand. It could not generate productivity growth. It could allocate resources, but it could not create wealth. Soviet GDP grew rapidly through the 1950s by mobilizing unused labor and building factories. Once those one-time gains were exhausted, growth stalled. By 1970, Soviet economic performance was deteriorating. Official statistics claimed 4 to 5% annual growth. Western economists estimated real growth at 2%. Some Soviet economists privately believed growth had already turned negative. The gap between official propaganda and economic reality was widening into a chasm. The structural problem was simple. The Soviet economy existed to feed the military-industrial complex. Between 20 and 25% of GDP flowed to defense spending. Another 15 to 20% subsidized inefficient state enterprises. That left perhaps 60% for consumption and civilian investment. In a growing economy, this might work. In a stagnant economy, it guaranteed impoverishment. The Soviet leadership faced a choice they consistently refused to make: reform the economy or maintain the military, introduce market mechanisms or preserve central planning, reduce defense spending or accept economic decline. They chose military power over economic health. They chose ideological purity over practical reform. They chose to maintain the facade of superpower status even as the economic foundation crumbled beneath them. This choice was codified in the Soviet budget process. Each year, the Ministry of Defense submitted spending requests to the Politburo. Each year, the requests increased. Each year, the Politburo approved them. The military received priority access to resources, skilled labor, advanced technology, and hard currency. The civilian economy received what remained, which was never enough. The dependency that would destroy the Soviet Union was already visible by 1975. The economy had stopped generating real growth, but the commitments kept expanding. Defense spending grew annually. The Eastern European satellites demanded subsidies. Client states in Cuba, Vietnam, and Africa required financial support. The numbers did not balance. The Soviet Union was spending more than it earned. The deficit grew year after year. The only thing keeping the system afloat was oil. In 1973, OPEC embargoed Western nations and oil prices quadrupled from $3 to $12 per barrel. By 1980, oil traded above $35. The Soviet Union was the world's largest oil producer. High oil prices generated a windfall of hard currency that papered over the economic dysfunction. Soviet planners built their budgets assuming high prices would continue indefinitely. They were wrong, and when oil prices collapsed, the Soviet economy collapsed with them, because the Soviet Union was not an economy with an oil industry. It was an oil industry with an economy attached, and when the oil revenue disappeared, the entire structure came crashing down. The economic war began in earnest on January 20, 1981. Ronald Reagan took the oath of office and immediately ordered a fundamental reassessment of Cold War strategy. The consensus in Washington had been détente, coexistence, managing competition with the Soviet Union. Reagan rejected this framework entirely. He believed the Soviet economy was vulnerable and that economic pressure could force systemic collapse. Reagan's advisors presented him with intelligence assessments that confirmed his intuition. The Soviet economy was far weaker than public estimates suggested. The CIA estimated Soviet GDP at approximately 60% of American GDP. The reality was closer to 40%. The Soviet Union was spending 15 to 17% of this smaller GDP on defense. The arithmetic was unsustainable. The National Security Council developed a strategy built on economic warfare. Deny the Soviets hard currency. Force increased military spending. Exploit technological superiority. Collapse oil prices. Bleed them in Afghanistan. The goal was not military victory. The goal was economic exhaustion. Make the Soviets choose between bankruptcy and reform. Either outcome served American interests. The first weapon was deployed on March 23, 1983. Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system that would render Soviet nuclear weapons obsolete. The technology was theoretical at best. The physics were questionable. The cost estimates ranged from $100 billion to $1 trillion, but Reagan was not trying to build Star Wars. He was trying to force the Soviets to respond to it, and they did. Soviet intelligence concluded that America had achieved a breakthrough that threatened the entire Soviet nuclear arsenal. Marshal Nikolai Agarkov warned the Politburo that the Soviet Union needed to develop countermeasures immediately. The cost projections were staggering. Some estimates suggested matching American efforts would require an additional 40 to 50 billion rubles annually. 40 to 50 billion rubles the Soviet budget did not have. Think about what that meant in practical terms. The Soviet economy was generating roughly 800 billion rubles in total output. Defense spending already consumed 150 to 200 billion rubles. Now the military wanted another 50 billion. That would bring total defense spending to over 25% of GDP in an economy with zero real growth. The mathematics were impossible, but the Soviets had to respond. Superpower status required strategic parity. If America deployed space-based defenses and the Soviets did not, the correlation of forces would shift decisively. Soviet nuclear deterrence would become questionable. The entire foundation of Soviet security would collapse. They had no choice but to match American spending even though they could not afford it. The second weapon struck in 1985. Oil prices collapsed. In November 1985, oil traded at $32 per barrel. By July 1986, the price had fallen to $10. By 1988, oil was trading below $15 and would remain suppressed for over a decade. The revenue destruction was catastrophic. Do the arithmetic. The Soviet Union exported approximately 3 million barrels of oil per day at $30 per barrel. That generated $90 million per day, or roughly $33 billion annually. At $10 per barrel, the same 3 million barrels generated only $11 billion annually. $22 billion in hard currency disappeared. $22 billion the Soviet budget had already allocated to defense programs, subsidies, and debt payments. The oil price collapse was not accidental. The Reagan administration worked closely with Saudi Arabia to increase production. The Saudis ramped output from 3 million barrels per day to over 5 million. The market flooded, prices collapsed. The timing was coordinated with American strategy. The mechanism was deliberate. This was economic warfare executed through commodity markets. By the mid-1980s, it had turned into a death spiral. Defense spending continued increasing. Oil revenue was collapsing. Economic growth had stopped. The Soviet budget deficit exploded from 3% of GDP in 1980 to 12% by 1989. The government printed rubles to cover the gap. Inflation began accelerating. The ruble's value deteriorated. Foreign creditors demanded higher interest rates on Soviet borrowing. The Soviet leadership confronted a financial crisis that had no solution within the existing system. They could not reduce defense spending without abandoning superpower status. They could not raise taxes because the economy was already overtaxed. They could not borrow more because Western banks were increasingly reluctant to extend credit. They could not print money without triggering hyperinflation. Every option led to disaster. Then Afghanistan turned from a military problem into a financial catastrophe. The December 1979 invasion was supposed to be quick and cheap. Soviet military planners estimated the operation would cost perhaps $2 billion and require 6 to 12 months. 9 years later, Soviet forces were still fighting. The war consumed $15 billion annually. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers rotated through Afghanistan. 15,000 died. The wounded numbered over 50,000. But the real damage was financial. $15 billion per year represented nearly 20% of the hard currency the Soviet Union earned from oil exports. The Afghan War was consuming money that Soviet planners had allocated to importing Western technology, servicing foreign debt, and purchasing grain to cover agricultural shortfalls. The war was bleeding the treasury at precisely the moment oil revenue was collapsing. The Americans understood what they were doing. The CIA supplied Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen through Pakistan. American weapons shot down Soviet helicopters and transport aircraft. The war that was already expensive became even more costly. Soviet forces required more aircraft, more armor, more supplies to operate in an environment where the insurgents possessed advanced anti-aircraft capabilities. Every Stinger missile the CIA supplied cost the Soviet treasury millions of dollars in replacement equipment and expanded operations. The warning signs were everywhere. Soviet citizens noticed consumer goods disappearing from stores. The quality of available products deteriorated. Housing construction slowed. Infrastructure maintenance was deferred. The bread lines grew longer. The promises of communist prosperity rang hollow when workers spent hours queuing for basic necessities, while the government spent billions on missiles and tanks. Soviet economists began writing reports warning of systemic crisis. One classified assessment from 1985 estimated that if current trends continued, Soviet hard currency reserves would be exhausted by 1990. Another report warned that the deficit was spinning out of control and that the Soviet Union risked defaulting on foreign debt. A third analysis concluded that real wages had been declining for a decade and would continue falling unless the government reduced military spending. The Politburo ignored the warnings. They had built their entire legitimacy on military power and superpower status. Admitting they could no longer afford to compete with America meant admitting the Soviet system had failed. So they continued spending. They continued borrowing. They continued printing rubles. They continued the death spiral even as the economic foundation disintegrated beneath them. The moment of truth arrived in early 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in March at age 54. He was a younger generation leader who had not participated in World War II and who understood that the Soviet economy was in terminal decline. One of his first acts was to order comprehensive reviews of Soviet economic performance and budget sustainability. What the reviews revealed was shocking even to senior leadership. The Soviet economy had not grown in real terms since the late 1970s. Official statistics showing 2 to 3% growth were fabricated. Industrial output had stagnated. Agricultural production was declining. Productivity growth was negative. The Soviet Union was becoming poorer in absolute terms while spending an increasing percentage of shrinking output on defense. The budget numbers were even worse. Defense spending had risen to between 22 and 25% of GDP, depending on how you calculated it. The deficit exceeded 12% of GDP. Hard currency reserves were depleting rapidly. The Soviet Union was 6 to 12 months away from being unable to service foreign debt. Default was no longer theoretical. It was imminent. Gorbachev convened emergency meetings with economic advisors. They presented him with three options. First, radically reduce military spending and risk losing superpower status. Second, implement market reforms and risk undermining communist ideology. Third, continue current policies and accept economic collapse within 2 to 3 years. There was no fourth option. The mathematics had reached their conclusion. The Soviet Union faced the classic choice of declining empires: cut the military and survive in diminished form, or maintain military spending and collapse entirely. Gorbachev chose survival. In December 1988, he announced at the United Nations that the Soviet Union would unilaterally reduce its military by 500,000 troops. He withdrew forces from Eastern Europe. He canceled weapons programs worth billions of rubles. He ended subsidies to client states. The cuts were presented as peace initiatives. Western media celebrated Gorbachev as a reformer. The reality was more brutal. The Soviet Union was bankrupt. The treasury could no longer afford to pay for the empire. Gorbachev was cutting military spending because the alternative was state bankruptcy and complete economic collapse. This was not choice. This was necessity, but the cuts came too late. The economic damage was already terminal. Between 1985 and 1990, Soviet GDP contracted by an estimated 5 to 10%. Real wages fell by 15 to 20%. Consumer goods shortages became acute. Rationing was introduced in many cities. The Soviet state was losing its ability to provide for the population while maintaining any pretense of superpower status. The foreign debt crisis exploded in 1990. Western banks refused to extend new credit. Existing loans came due. The Soviet Union needed to roll over approximately $20 billion in debt while also paying interest on outstanding obligations. But hard currency reserves had fallen below $10 billion. The numbers did not work. Default was unavoidable. In November 1990, Gorbachev requested emergency assistance from Western governments. He needed loan guarantees to avoid default. The request revealed the magnitude of Soviet economic collapse to the world. The superpower that had challenged American supremacy for 40 years was begging for financial assistance to avoid bankruptcy. The economic humiliation was complete. The IMF dispatched teams to Moscow to assess Soviet finances. What they found confirmed the worst fears. The Soviet economy was in free fall. The budget deficit was out of control. The banking system was insolvent. The currency was collapsing. The entire economic structure was disintegrating. The IMF economists concluded that the Soviet Union needed $200 billion in assistance and comprehensive market reforms to avoid total collapse. $200 billion. The Soviet Union had spent itself into a hole so deep that recovery required assistance equal to 25% of GDP. And even with that assistance, the IMF estimated recovery would take a decade and require privatizing state enterprises, introducing market pricing, and dismantling the command economy. In other words, recovery required destroying the Soviet system. The Soviet leadership realized the game was over. The economy had collapsed. The treasury was empty. The state could not pay its debts, could not feed its people, could not maintain basic services. 69 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist economic experiment had ended in bankruptcy and systemic failure. The economic collapse triggered political disintegration. The Soviet Union had maintained control over its empire through a combination of military power and economic subsidy. When the money disappeared, both pillars crumbled simultaneously. The outer empire broke away first. Then the Soviet Union itself dissolved. Poland held free elections in June 1989. Solidarity won a landslide victory. The communist government fell without Soviet intervention because the Soviet Union could no longer afford to intervene. Keeping troops in Eastern Europe cost billions of rubles annually. Suppressing unrest required military operations that consumed resources the Soviet budget no longer had. The economics made intervention impossible. Hungary opened its borders in September 1989. East Germans fled to the west by the thousands. The Berlin Wall fell on November 9, 1989. The Soviet Union watched its German satellite disintegrate without deploying a single soldier because the military operations required to maintain East Germany would cost tens of billions of rubles. The treasury could not fund suppression, so the empire cracked. The Czechoslovak Velvet Revolution occurred in November 1989. The Romanian Revolution followed in December. By January 1990, the entire Eastern European empire had broken away. The Soviet Union had lost control of its buffer zone, its forward military positions, and its ideological satellites. The collapse happened in weeks because the economic foundation had already crumbled. When the money disappeared, the empire dissolved. But the real catastrophe was unfolding inside the Soviet Union itself. The budget deficit exceeded 15% of GDP by 1990. The government was printing rubles to cover obligations. Inflation reached triple digits. The currency was collapsing. Consumer goods had largely disappeared from state stores. Black markets flourished. The Soviet state was losing its ability to govern. The republics began demanding independence. The Baltic states moved first. Lithuania declared independence in March 1990. Latvia and Estonia followed. The central government in Moscow lacked the financial resources to suppress the independence movements militarily. The army needed to be paid. Soldiers needed to be fed. Operations required fuel and ammunition. All of this cost money, money the treasury did not have. Ukraine declared sovereignty in July 1990. Belarus followed. The Central Asian republics began negotiating with Moscow for greater autonomy and control over local resources. Soviet Union was fracturing along economic lines. The republics understood that remaining in the Union meant subsidizing Moscow's bankruptcy. Independence meant keeping local revenue for local use. The human cost of economic collapse was staggering. Between 1989 and 1994, real wages in Russia fell by over 50%. Life expectancy declined by 5 years. Birth rates collapsed. Death rates spiked. Alcoholism and suicide rates increased dramatically. The population began shrinking. The economic catastrophe translated into demographic disaster. The Soviet military-industrial complex that had consumed 25% of GDP for decades was dismantled almost overnight. Factories that built tanks were shuttered. Missile production lines closed. Aircraft plants laid off hundreds of thousands of workers. Entire cities built around defense enterprises became economic disaster zones. The unemployment rate in some military-industrial towns exceeded 50%. The extraction system that had funneled resources from the entire Soviet economy into the defense sector collapsed when there were no resources left to extract. The mechanism was elegant in its brutality. The state commanded resources. The state allocated resources to military production. The state impoverished its own people to fund weapons that provided no economic return. When the economy stopped producing, the extraction stopped. When the extraction stopped, the military-industrial complex collapsed. The sovereignty death occurred on December 25, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. The hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin. The Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 independent republics emerged from the ruins. The superpower that had challenged American hegemony ceased to exist. 74 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the communist experiment ended in bankruptcy and state dissolution. The final accounting revealed the magnitude of the disaster. Between 1975 and 1991, the Soviet Union had spent approximately $4 trillion on defense. $4 trillion extracted from an economy that generated perhaps $12 trillion in total output during those 16 years. $1 in 3 went to the military. 1 worker in 4 was employed in defense industries. 1/3 of industrial production was military hardware. The return on this investment was catastrophic. The Soviet Union got nuclear weapons it could never use, conventional forces that could never be deployed, and strategic capabilities that provided no security when the economy collapsed. The weapons were worthless when the treasury was empty. The tanks could not prevent state bankruptcy. The missiles could not stop political disintegration. The Americans understood what they had accomplished. They had forced the Soviet Union into unsustainable spending through a combination of arms race acceleration, oil price manipulation, and proxy war extension. The Strategic Defense Initiative that triggered massive Soviet countermeasure spending never worked. The oil price collapse that destroyed Soviet hard currency revenue was engineered. The Afghan War that bled $15 billion annually was extended by American weapons shipments. Every pressure point was deliberately designed to increase Soviet spending while reducing Soviet revenue. The cost to America was minimal. The Reagan defense buildup cost approximately $2 trillion between 1981 and 1989. But this spending came from an economy generating over $40 trillion in total output during those years. America spent 5% of its wealth to force the Soviet Union to spend 25% of its wealth. The exchange rate was catastrophically favorable to America. The Soviets paid 5 times more for strategic parity that provided no economic benefit. The lesson was clear. Economic power determines military power. Industrial capacity determines sustainable defense spending. When a smaller economy tries to match a larger economy's military expenditure, the smaller economy breaks first. The Soviet Union broke in 1989. The political collapse followed in 1991. The economy died before the state dissolved. The story of Soviet economic collapse is the ultimate lesson in the primacy of economics in strategic competition. The Soviet Union possessed 45,000 nuclear warheads, fielded 5 million soldiers, and controlled an empire spanning 11 time zones. None of it mattered when the treasury ran dry. The long shadow of this collapse extends forward to the present day. Russia never recovered from the 1990s economic catastrophe. The GDP of the Russian Federation today is smaller than Italy's. The population is declining. The economy remains dependent on oil and gas exports. The military capabilities that once challenged NATO have deteriorated. The superpower became a regional power because the economic foundation was destroyed and never rebuilt. But the Soviet collapse teaches a broader lesson about great power competition. When China increases defense spending, when they build aircraft carriers and expand their military footprint, when they seek strategic parity with the United States, remember what happened to the Soviet Union. Remember that economic competition precedes military competition. Remember that the treasury breaks before the army breaks. Remember that sustainable military power requires sustainable economic growth. Look at the current dynamics through the lens of Soviet experience. China spends approximately 2% of GDP on defense officially. Western intelligence estimates suggest the real number is closer to 3 to 4%. The Chinese economy is roughly $20 trillion. That means Chinese defense spending is between $400 billion and $800 billion annually depending on measurement methodology. America spends approximately $800 billion on defense from an economy of $25 trillion. The arithmetic is different than the Cold War, but the principles remain identical. The sustainable level of defense spending depends on GDP growth, economic efficiency, and resource allocation. If China tries to match American military capabilities through spending alone, they will confront the same trade-offs the Soviet Union faced. Military spending versus civilian investment, defense procurement versus economic modernization, strategic capabilities versus domestic prosperity. The Soviet Union made the wrong choice systematically for 40 years. They chose military power over economic health. They chose superpower status over sustainable growth. They chose to maintain strategic parity even as it bankrupted the state. The result was economic collapse followed by political disintegration. When you hear about defense budgets and military spending today, remember that the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization multiple times over. It did not prevent their collapse. Remember that they had the world's largest army. It did not save them when the treasury was empty. Remember that they controlled half of Europe. It did not stop the empire from dissolving when they could no longer afford to maintain it. The economy breaks first. The military breaks second. The state breaks last. This is the universal sequence of imperial decline. Ignore it at your peril. The Soviet Union died of bankruptcy before it died politically. The economic crisis of 1989 to 1991 preceded and caused the political collapse. When Gorbachev ordered military spending cuts in 1988, he was not choosing peace. He was acknowledging insolvency. When the Eastern European satellites broke away in 1989, the Soviet Union was not choosing to let them go. They simply could not afford to keep them. The lesson is definitive. Economic warfare is more effective than military warfare. Financial pressure achieves what missile strikes cannot. When you force an adversary to choose between bankruptcy and strategic retreat, you have already won. The Soviet Union chose bankruptcy, and then they ceased to exist. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.